12 men, 40 pounds of TNT, and absolute silence. That was all they had to destroy the Volturno Dam before dawn on October 9, 1943. And if they failed, the entire Fifth Army offensive would grind to a halt in the Italian mud. The briefing had been simple enough when Colonel William Darby laid it out in the bombed-out farmhouse they were using as Ranger headquarters, 5 miles south of the Volturno River. The Germans had blown every bridge across the river as they retreated north, but they'd left the dam intact, not out of kindness but calculation. They controlled the sluice gates. When the Americans tried to cross, the Germans would open those gates and release millions of gallons of water, turning the river valley into a killing field. The crossing sites would become death traps. Sherman tanks would sink into suddenly flooded mud. Infantry would drown in their foxholes. The attack would fail before it began. "We need that dam gone," Darby had said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact the way it always was before the really bad missions. "Air Corps can't touch it. It's in a valley with mountains on both sides. Impossible bombing run. Plus, it's less than 2 miles from where our forward units are dug in. One bomb goes long and we're killing our own men. Artillery would take a week to knock it down and alert every German in Italy, and we attack in 18 hours. So it's going to be you." Master Sergeant Jake Sullivan had looked at the aerial reconnaissance photos spread across the table. The dam was a concrete and earthwork structure, not one of the massive Mussolini showpieces, but a smaller strategic dam the Germans had reinforced and modified. Intelligence said it controlled water flow to the entire valley, perfect for the Germans to flood American crossing points. What made it worse was its location. Too small for strategic bombing to bother with, too important to ignore. The Germans knew this. They'd fortified it with machine gun nests on both ends, barbed wire along the approaches, and, according to intelligence, at least a platoon of Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite troops who'd fought the Rangers before in Sicily at Gela and would fight them again at Cisterna. These weren't regular Wehrmacht. These were the best the Germans had. "How many men do I get?" Sullivan had asked. 12, 6 of my Rangers, 6 engineers from the 36th Division. The engineers know demolitions. Your Rangers know how to get them there quietly." Darby had tapped the photo. "You go in tonight, silent infiltration. No shooting unless absolutely necessary. Place the charges at the base. The engineers will show you where. Timer fuses set for 0530. You'll have 90 minutes to get clear before it blows." Sullivan had studied the photos again. "What about the garrison?" "That's your problem to solve, Sergeant, but solve it quietly. 1 shot, 1 flare, 1 alert, and they'll call in reinforcements from the 16th Panzer Division. They're only 6 miles north. If they know you're there, none of you are coming back." That had been 8 hours ago. Now Sullivan was belly down in the mud on the south bank of the Volturno, studying the dam through German binoculars he'd taken off a dead officer at Salerno. The moon was new, deliberately chosen for maximum darkness, and he could barely make out the massive structure against the stars, but he could hear it. The steady rumble of water through the spillways, the occasional cough of a guard, the scratch of a match being lit in one of the machine gun positions. Behind him, his team waited in the shadows. The Rangers were his men, hand-picked. Corporal Tommy Novak from Chicago, small and quick, best knife man in the battalion. Private First Class Jim Tennessee Walker, so quiet he could cross a room full of broken glass without making a sound. And though few knew it, his Bavarian grandmother had taught him German as a child, a skill he kept to himself. Private Angelo Torelli from Brooklyn, who'd grown up breaking into warehouses and could pick any lock ever made. Private Bobby Chen from San Francisco's Chinatown, youngest man in the unit at 19 but absolutely fearless. and Private Patrick O'Brien from Boston, strong as an ox and smart enough to know when to use that strength and when not to. The engineers were strangers to him, transferred in just for this mission. Their leader was Technical Sergeant Roy Hutchinson, a mining engineer from Colorado before the war. The man knew explosives the way Sullivan knew small unit tactics, intimately, instinctively. With Hutchinson were 5 more engineers: Corporal Dave Martinez from Texas, Private Carl Johnson from Minnesota, Private Eugene Washington from Alabama, Private Leo Kowalski from Pittsburgh, and Private Sam Goldman from Brooklyn, not far from where Torelli grew up, though they'd never met before the war. Sullivan had spent 2 hours that afternoon watching them work with the TNT, and he had to admit they knew their business. They'd turned 40 pounds of explosives into 12 separate charges, each one shaped to direct the blast inward, maximizing damage to the dam's structure. Cutting the fence in 30 seconds, Sullivan whispered to Hutchinson. They'd been observing for an hour, timing the guard patterns. Every 15 minutes, 2 guards walked the top of the dam from opposite directions, met in the middle, talked for maybe 30 seconds, then walked back. They'd just started their walk. Sullivan's team had 14 minutes to get through the fence, across 200 yards of open ground, and to the base of the dam. Tennessee Walker and Angelo Torelli moved forward with wire cutters. The fence was new, German engineered, but the Italians who'd installed it hadn't done the best job. There were gaps at the bottom where rainwater had washed out the soil. Walker and Torelli didn't need to cut much, just enough to widen one of those gaps. Sullivan counted silently. At 28 seconds, Walker raised his hand. Gap was ready. Sullivan tapped each man as they moved through. Rangers first to secure the approach, then engineers with the explosives. They moved in a low crouch, weapons ready but fingers off triggers. One accidental discharge and they were all dead. The ground between the fence and the dam was rough, cratered from Allied bombing runs that had missed the target. That was good. The craters provided cover. Bad, because they were full of October rainwater and mud that sucked at their boots. Sullivan placed each man carefully, creating a security perimeter while the engineers moved to the dam's base. That's when they found the first problem. Hutchinson crawled back to Sullivan, his face grim even in the darkness. The intel was wrong. The dam's not just concrete. There's a steel reinforcement grid running through it. Our charges won't punch through, not configured the way they are now. Sullivan checked his watch. They'd been on site for 4 minutes. 10 minutes until the guards reached the center of the dam again. Can you reconfigure them? Not here, not in the dark. We'd need to completely rewire the charges, reshape them. That's an hour's work minimum, and we'd need light. Sullivan's mind raced. Abort the mission? Fifth Army would attack in the morning into a flooded valley. Hundreds, maybe thousands would die. Continue with inadequate charges. The dam might not fall, and they'd have revealed their presence for nothing. There's another option, Hutchinson whispered. The spillway gates. If we can get inside the control room, we can pack the charges around the gate mechanisms. Blow those, and the gates can't close. Water pressure will do the rest. Might take a few hours, but the dam will fail. Sullivan looked up at the dam. The control room was a concrete structure built into the dam's eastern end, accessible through a steel door at the base. That door was certainly locked, and the control room was directly under one of the machine gun positions. Torelli, Sullivan whispered. The Brooklyn private crawled over. See that door? How long to pick it? Torelli studied it through the scope on his M1. Depends on the lock. German military padlock, maybe 2 minutes. If it's something fancy, could be 5. You've got 3. They moved as a unit, Rangers providing security while Torelli worked on the lock. Sullivan could hear the guards above them now, boots on concrete, the casual conversation of men who'd been on duty too long and didn't expect trouble. The Americans pressed themselves against the dam's base, invisible in the shadow but completely exposed if anyone looked straight down. The Germans had made a classic mistake. Their machine gun positions were designed to cover approaches to the dam, not the base of the dam itself. Once you got close enough, you were in their blind spot. It was a flaw Sullivan had noticed in the aerial photos, the reason he'd agreed to this insane mission. The lock clicked. Torelli grinned in the darkness. "Piece of cake, Sarge. Germans make good locks, but they're all the same." The door opened silently. Recently oiled hinges, because Germans maintained everything. Inside was pitch black. Sullivan risked a quick flash of his covered flashlight. The control room was maybe 20 feet square, filled with wheels, gauges, and the massive gears that operated the spillway gates. Perfect for what they needed. "How long to place the charges?" Sullivan asked Hutchinson. 15 minutes to do it right. We need to pack them into the gear housings, run the wires, connect the timers." Sullivan checked his watch again. 3 minutes until the guards met at the center. They'd have to wait for the next cycle. That meant sitting silent in the dark for 18 minutes while the engineers worked. His Rangers would hold security, but if anyone came down those stairs— "Do it," Sullivan said. The engineers moved into the control room like shadows. Sullivan positioned his Rangers, Chen and O'Brien watching the door, Novak and Walker at the windows, Torelli watching the stairs that led up into the dam structure. Sullivan himself stayed in the doorway, coordinating. The minutes crawled by. Sullivan could hear every sound, the engineers breathing as they worked, the scrape of boots on concrete above, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the German lines. His hands were steady on his Thompson submachine gun, but sweat ran down his back despite the October chill. 8 minutes. The guards were walking their routes again. Sullivan could track them by the sound of their boots, getting closer to the eastern end where his team was working. 10 minutes. One of the guards stopped almost directly above them. Sullivan heard the distinctive sound of a zipper, then liquid splashing. The guard was taking a piss off the dam. In the control room, the engineers froze. 12 minutes. Goldman, the New York engineer, was connecting the timer wires when his wrench slipped, clanging against a pipe. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the night. Everyone stopped breathing. Above them, the guard said something in German. His partner laughed. They kept walking, 15 minutes. Hutchinson crawled to Sullivan. "Charges are set, timers ready, but Sarge, we've got a problem." Of course there was a problem. There was always a problem. The timers are mechanical. Once we start them, we've got exactly 90 minutes. But listen. Hutchinson held up one of the timer devices. Even in the silence, Sullivan could hear it. Tick, tick, tick. Guards are going to hear this. These things tick like Big Ben. No way they don't investigate. Sullivan thought fast. They needed the dam destroyed, but they also needed to get out alive to report the mission's success. If the guards heard the timers and raised the alarm before the charges blew, can we muffle them? Not enough. Maybe if we had blankets, sandbags, something to absorb the sound, but with what we've got, they'll hear them within 5 minutes. Sullivan made the decision. We do it different. No timers. We run that cord back to the fence line, minimum safe distance. Blow it manually. That's 300 feet of dit cord. We've only got one spool, maybe 200 feet. Then we blow it from closer. Hutchinson shook his head. Sarge, 40 pounds of TNT in an enclosed space like that control room. The blast is going to be channeled out through the doorway. Anybody within 100 feet is going to get turned into hamburger. Remember what happened to those engineers at Gila when they underestimated blast pressure? Sullivan remembered. Sicily. 2 months after the landing. Engineers trying to clear a German bunker had gotten too close to their own charges. 3 dead, 4 wounded. But this was different. This had to be different. Then we'd better be 101 feet away. They worked quickly now, plans changing on the fly. The engineers removed the timers, replaced them with blasting caps connected to DT cord. They ran the cord out the door, along the base of the dam, using what little they had. It reached 170 feet, still 30 feet short of minimum safe distance, but it would have to do. 25 minutes on site now. The guards would cycle again in 5 minutes. They needed to be gone before then. That's when Murphy's Law kicked in hard. The steel door at the top of the stairs opened. Light flooded down. A German voice called, "Wilhelm, bist du da unten?" "Wilhelm, are you down there?" Every American froze. The voice called again, more insistent. Footsteps started down the stairs. Sullivan had about 2 seconds to decide. Fight or hide. Fighting meant the mission was blown. Gunfire would bring every German for miles. Hiding was impossible. 12 men in a 20-foot room with 1 door. Unless... Sullivan grabbed Tennessee Walker, whispered directly into his ear. Walker nodded, stepped into the stairwell, and called up in perfect German, "Ja, ich komme gleich." "Yes, I'm coming right up." The footsteps stopped. The German said something else, too fast for Sullivan to catch. Walker responded with a cough and more German, something about checking the gate mechanisms. The footsteps retreated. The door closed. Sullivan stared at Walker. "You speak German?" "My grandma was from Bavaria, Sarge. Didn't seem important to mention before. It's important now. What did he want?" "Coffee. They're brewing coffee up there and wondered if Wilhelm wanted some." I told him Wilhelm, that's me now, I guess, would be up in a minute. Sullivan thought fast. They had a German-speaking ranger and a guard who was expected upstairs. This could work. "Walker, you're going up. Take Novak with you. Silent entry. Take out whoever's up there quietly. We need 5 more minutes." Walker nodded, started unbuttoning his jacket to hide his American uniform as much as possible. Novak pulled out his knife, a wicked 6-inch blade he kept sharp enough to shave with. They went up the stairs. Sullivan counted seconds. At 45, he heard a muffled thump. At 60, another. At 90, Walker's voice drifted down. "Clear, Sarge. 2 guards, both down." "Dead?" "Very." Now they had dead Germans in the dam, charges ready to blow, and about 3 minutes before the walking guards completed their circuit and discovered either the bodies or the DT cord or both. "Everybody out," Sullivan ordered. "Engineers first." Rangers collapsed back in sequence. "Walker, drag those bodies down here. Maybe it'll confuse them about what happened." They moved fast now. Noise discipline balanced against speed. The engineers scrambled through the gap in the fence, Hutchinson trailing the DT cord behind him. The Rangers pulled back in pairs, covering each other. Walker and Novak dragged the dead Germans into the control room, threw them on top of the charges. That would confuse the investigation afterward. Sullivan was the last man through the fence. He could see the guards up on the dam now, flashlight swinging, voices raised. They'd found something. Maybe blood, maybe the open door. In seconds, they'd raise the alarm. The team ran, stumbling through the cratered ground, dead cord unspooling behind them. At 150 feet, Hutchinson stopped. "This is as far as we can get. Everybody down." They threw themselves into a crater, faces in the mud. Hutchinson had the detonator, a simple handheld electrical generator. Squeeze the handle, generate current. Current runs down the det cord, hits the blasting caps, boom. On the dam, a siren started wailing. Lights blazed on, German voices shouted orders. "Now?" Hutchinson asked. 10 more seconds, Sullivan said. "Let them get closer to the control room." He counted. At 8 seconds, several Germans ran into the control room, flashlights probing. At 10, Sullivan said, "Now." Hutchinson squeezed the detonator. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the eastern end of the Volturno Dam erupted. The explosion was massive, even bigger than Hutchinson had predicted. 40 pounds of TNT confined in a concrete room, channeled by the dam's structure. The blast wave hit Sullivan's team even pressed down in the crater, a physical force that crushed the air from their lungs. The sound was beyond sound, a physical impact that left ears ringing, bleeding. But it was the visual that Sullivan would remember forever. The entire eastern end of the dam seemed to bulge outward for an instant, backlit by the explosion from within. Then it shattered. Not collapsed, shattered, like a window hit by a baseball. Chunks of concrete, some the size of cars, flew through the air. The machine gun position above the control room simply ceased to exist. The steel spillway gates, each weighing several tons, were ripped from their housings and flung into the river below. And then came the water. With the gates gone, nothing held back the reservoir. Millions of gallons began pouring through the shattered opening. A thunderous roar that made the explosion seem quiet by comparison. The dam didn't collapse entirely. The western section still stood. But it didn't matter. The breach was catastrophic. Within minutes, the entire reservoir would drain through that hole. "Move! Move! Move!" Sullivan screamed, though no one could hear him over the roar of water. They ran west, parallel to the river, trying to get out of the flood zone. Behind them, German sirens wailed, flares shot into the sky, and the thunder of escaping water grew louder. The Germans wouldn't pursue, couldn't pursue. Their vehicles couldn't navigate the suddenly flooded valley. Their troops were scrambling to higher ground to avoid being swept away. The water Sullivan's team had unleashed was now their shield. The 16th Panzer Division, so close and so deadly just minutes before, was now cut off by the very flood the Germans had planned to use against the Americans. They ran for 20 minutes before Sullivan finally called a halt. His men collapsed, gasping. They were maybe a mile from the dam now, on high ground. In the pre-dawn darkness, they could see lights converging on the dam. German vehicles, probably from the 16th Panzer. Too late, far too late. Sullivan did a head count. 12 men had gone in. He counted faces in the darkness. Novak, Walker, Torelli, Chen, O'Brien. The Rangers were all there. Hutchinson, Martinez, Johnson, Washington, Kowalski. Where was Goldman? "Where's Goldman?" Sullivan asked. Hutchinson looked around, panic in his eyes. "He was right behind me. Goldman, Sam." No answer. "He was limping," Washington said. "Caught some shrapnel from the blast. Said he was fine. Told me to keep going." Sullivan closed his eyes. They couldn't go back. The area would be crawling with Germans. Goldman was either dead or would be soon. One man for the mission. The arithmetic of war. "We keep moving," Sullivan said. "We've got to reach our lines before dawn." They marched through the rest of the night, staying off roads, avoiding German patrols that were now swarming the area. As the sky began to lighten in the east, they finally saw American positions. Forward elements of the 36th Infantry Division, dug in along a ridgeline. "Don't shoot," Sullivan called out in English. "Rangers coming in." An hour later, Sullivan was back in the bombed-out farmhouse, giving his report to Colonel Darby. The colonel listened without interrupting, then walked to the window. In the distance, they could see the Volturno Valley. Where yesterday there had been a river, there was now a muddy trickle. The reservoir was empty. The German defensive line, based on controlling the water flow, was useless. "The crossing begins in 2 hours, Darby said. "Thanks to you and your men, we'll walk across instead of swimming under fire." "How many did we lose?" "1. Private Goldman, from the engineers." "I'll write the letter to his family. What do I tell them?" Sullivan thought about Goldman, the kid from Brooklyn who'd dropped his wrench, who'd connected those timer wires with rock-steady hands, who'd limped into the darkness rather than slow down his team. Tell them he was a hero. Tell them he helped blow up a dam and saved thousands of American lives. Tell them— Sullivan paused. "Tell them he was the bravest man from Brooklyn I ever met." Darby nodded. "I'll put him in for the Silver Star. You and the rest of your team, too. This mission saved the entire offensive." Sullivan didn't care about medals. He was thinking about the explosion, about the dam shattering like glass, about millions of gallons of water roaring into the night. Mostly, he was thinking about Goldman, somewhere out there, dead or captured. The Fifth Army crossed the Volturno River on October 11, 1943, meeting minimal resistance. The Germans, without their water weapon, fell back to the Barbara Line, then to the Bernhardt Line, part of their strategic withdrawal to the Gustav Line where they'd make their real stand at Cassino. The official history would record the Volturno crossing as a textbook river assault, notable mainly for the speed of the advance despite autumn rains that had swollen the river. General Mark Clark would later write that he'd expected heavy casualties at the Volturno, but was surprised by the weak German resistance. There was no mention of a dam explosion, no mention of 12 men with 40 pounds of TNT, no mention of Private Sam Goldman from Brooklyn. The truth was buried in classified Ranger operations files. That's how it was with Ranger operations. The spectacular failures made headlines, like the disaster at Cisterna, where 2 entire Ranger battalions were destroyed, 767 men killed or captured in 3 hours. The spectacular successes were classified, buried in archives known only to the men who were there. Why? Because success meant the enemy didn't know what hit them, and the tactics could be used again. Because Rangers were meant to be ghosts, and ghosts don't leave calling cards. Because sometimes the methods were too brutal for public consumption. Commando raids weren't clean warfare. They were about slitting throats in the dark and blowing things up when nobody was looking. Jake Sullivan survived the war. He made it through Anzio, where the Rangers were virtually wiped out in the disaster at Cisterna. 767 Rangers went out. Only 6 came back. Sullivan was one of the few who'd been held in reserve that day. He was one of the even fewer Rangers who transitioned to the new Ranger battalions that were formed for D-Day. He climbed the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, though that's another story entirely. After the war, he went home to Michigan, got married, had kids, never talked about the war much. When people asked about his service, he'd just say he was with Darby's Rangers in Italy, and most people would nod without really knowing what that meant, that he was one of the original American commandos, one of the few who survived from Sicily to Germany. But every October 9th, for the rest of his life, Jake would find a quiet bar, order a beer, and raise a silent toast to Sam Goldman, the kid from Brooklyn who'd helped blow a dam and change the course of a battle, who'd limped into the darkness rather than slow down his team, who'd died alone somewhere in the Italian mountains so that thousands of other Americans could live. The other survivors had their own rituals. Tommy Novak became a cop in Chicago, and every year on the anniversary, he'd sharpen his old combat knife, the one he'd carried up those stairs. Tennessee Walker became a German teacher of all things. Turned out his grandma's Bavarian dialect had given him a gift for languages. He never told his students how he'd learned the importance of speaking the enemy's language. Angelo Torelli went back to Brooklyn, but now he fixed locks instead of picking them, ran a locksmith shop for 40 years. Bobby Chen opened a restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, and if you knew to ask, he'd tell you about the night he helped blow up an Italian dam. Patrick O'Brien became a construction worker in Boston, specialized in demolition. He knew exactly how much explosive it took to bring down a structure. Roy Hutchinson went back to Colorado, back to mining. He never worked with explosives again, said he'd used up his lifetime allocation in one night in Italy. Carl Johnson, the Minnesota engineer, became a high school science teacher. Every year, when he taught his students about potential and kinetic energy, he'd describe water pressure and dam failures, though he never mentioned he'd caused one. Dave Martinez went into oil drilling in Texas. Eugene Washington became a Baptist minister in Alabama, and Leo Kowalski opened a hardware store in Pittsburgh. They all carried that night with them. Different ways, different memories, but always there. The Volturno Valley has several small dams now, built for irrigation and flood control in the 1950s and 60s, none of them military objectives anymore. If you know where to look, at one of the older structures near Amorosi, you can see repairs in the concrete that don't quite match, work done in haste in 1943, and then properly rebuilt after the war. The Italian government records listed as war damage 1943 without elaboration. Local farmers will tell you the Germans blew it during their retreat, though that doesn't explain why they would destroy something that helped their defense. The truth, like most Ranger operations, remains in files that were classified for 60 years and that nobody bothers to read now. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the raid, 6 of the surviving team members met in Italy. Jake Sullivan, Tennessee Walker, Roy Hutchinson, Carl Johnson, Dave Martinez, and Leo Kowalski. Bobby Chen had died of cancer in 1991. Tommy Novak had a heart attack in 1987. Angelo Torelli had been killed in a car accident in 1978. Patrick O'Brien had died in a construction accident in 1969, and Eugene Washington had passed in 1985. They were old men now, in their 70s, moving slowly, but they made the trip. They stood at the dam, looking up at the massive structure. An Italian tour guide was leading a group of Germans past, explaining the dam's hydroelectric importance. No mention of the war. No mention of the night it died. "Should we tell them?" Carl Johnson asked. "Tell them what?" Jake replied. "That 6 old Americans and a bunch of dead friends once blew this thing to hell. Who'd believe us? They found the spot where they'd placed the charges, now covered by the rebuilt structure. They found the fence line where they'd run the det cord. They found the crater where they'd taken cover when Hutchinson squeezed the detonator. Everything was different, but the ghosts were still there." On the way back to their hotel, they stopped at the American Military Cemetery at Anzio. They'd had a stone placed there for Sam Goldman, even though his body was never found. The Germans' records, checked after the war, showed no prisoner by that name. He'd simply vanished into the Italian night, one more ghost among millions. They stood at that stone, 6 old Rangers and engineers, and Jake Sullivan finally told them something he'd never told anyone. "Goldman made it to the fence," he said quietly. "I heard him behind us. Heard him call out, 'Wait up,' just before we blew it. That Brooklyn accent of his. Then the blast hit and nothing. I wanted to go back, but the Germans were already shooting flares, starting vehicles. We had maybe 30 seconds before they'd be on us. You couldn't go back, Roy Hutchinson said. None of us could. The Germans had that whole area sealed in minutes. I know, but I still hear him sometimes, in dreams, still calling out in that Brooklyn accent, still trying to catch up. Sometimes I wake up and for a second I think I should go back for him. 50 years later, and I still think I should go back. They left roses on Goldman's marker. Red roses from Brooklyn because that's where Sam was from. Then they flew home to their lives, their families, their memories. Jake Sullivan died in 2001, age 79. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his service with the Rangers, his Bronze Star and Silver Star, his work as a machinist after the war. It didn't mention the Volturno Dam. That remained classified until 2005, when the Army declassified a batch of World War II Special Operations records. Even then, nobody paid much attention. It was just one mission among thousands, 12 men among millions. A footnote in history books that already had too many footnotes. But it mattered. It mattered to the men of the 36th Infantry Division who crossed the Volturno on dry ground instead of under machine gun fire. It mattered to the families of soldiers who lived because a dam couldn't flood them out. It mattered to the course of the Italian campaign, which moved weeks faster because one barrier fell. And it mattered to Sam Goldman's family, who finally learned 60 years late what happened to their son. He wasn't missing in action. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a hero who helped 12 men destroy a dam with 40 pounds of TNT and absolute silence, who kept moving when he was hurt rather than slow down his team, who disappeared into history so others could live. The last survivor of the raid was Dave Martinez, who lived until 2009. Near the end, in a VA hospital in Houston, he told his grandson the whole story. The grandson, an Army officer himself, didn't believe it at first. It sounded too much like something from a movie. 12 men destroying a strategic dam with infiltration tactics and shaped charges, walking past German guards, escaping as millions of gallons of water poured into the valley. But then the grandson looked it up, found the declassified records, found the citation for his grandfather's Silver Star, which mentioned only extraordinary heroism during a classified operation in the Italian theater, found Italian records mentioning the dam's mysterious destruction on October 9, 1943, attributed vaguely to Allied bombing. It had really happened, exactly as the old man described. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" the grandson asked. Dave Martinez smiled, the tired smile of a man who'd carried secrets for 66 years. "Tell them what? That we snuck past German paratroopers and blew up a dam? That we killed probably a dozen Germans and lost one of our own? That we changed the course of a battle nobody remembers? Who'd believe it? And more importantly, who'd care?" "I care," his grandson said. "Then that's enough. One person who knows, who cares, who remembers. That's all any of us can ask for." Martinez died 3 days later. With him went the last living memory of that night at the Volturno Dam. The night 12 men with 40 pounds of TNT and a need for absolute silence made the impossible possible. The night Private Sam Goldman from Brooklyn limped into history and never came back. The night the dam died and the Fifth Army lived. There's no monument to mark what they did, no museum display, no chapter in the history books. Just a patch of slightly different colored concrete on a rebuilt dam, visible only when the light is right. But sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the only memorial that matters is the one carried in memory, passed down in stories, whispered in quiet moments when someone asks, "What did you do in the war?" Jake Sullivan's son found his father's war diary after Jake died. In it, written in faded pencil, was an entry for October 9, 1943. It was only one line. 12 men, 40 pounds, absolute silence. We did the impossible tonight. Below that, in different ink, obviously added years later, was another line. 11 came home. Never forget Goldman, that's all. No details, no drama, no elaboration. Just the facts, the way Rangers always reported them. But between those two lines was a story of courage, sacrifice, and the kind of quiet heroism that wins wars but never makes headlines. The kind of heroism that destroys dams in the darkness and saves armies at dawn. The kind that leaves men limping through Italian fields, chasing their units, determined to keep going no matter what. 12 men, 40 pounds of TNT. Absolute silence. And by dawn, the Volturno Dam was gone, its death roar echoing through the Italian mountains, carrying away German defenses and American blood in equal measure. The water flowed free, the Fifth Army crossed unopposed, and the war rolled on toward its inevitable conclusion. But for 11 men who made it home, and one who didn't, the war never really ended. It lived on in October nightmares, in anniversary toasts, in stories told to grandchildren who might or might not believe them. It lived in the knowledge that they'd done something extraordinary that no one would ever know about. Something that mattered desperately for exactly one night, and then vanished into classified files and fading memories. That's the nature of special operations. The successes disappear into secrecy. The failures make headlines. The men who do the impossible become ghosts, their stories buried deeper than the bodies of their friends. But sometimes, every now and then, one of those stories surfaces. Like bodies in water, they rise when you least expect them, demanding to be remembered, demanding to be told. This was one of those stories. 12 men who destroyed a dam and changed a battle. 11 who came home to live with what they'd done. One who vanished into the darkness, payment for the impossible. Private Sam Goldman from Brooklyn, somewhere in the Italian mountains, still trying to catch up to his unit, still running through history, still 22 years old, and limping toward a fence line he'll never reach. Remember him. Remember them all. They did the impossible when the impossible was the only option left. 12 men, 40 pounds, absolute silence, and a dam that died at dawn.